have taken the census, and if you have not, I hope you have become convinced to do so. I'll be adding the link onto at the bottom, sorry, at the end of the, right after I finish the introduction. So with that being said, we'd love to see your faces. I know that this is Zoom and a lot of people don't like to use their camera, but it does help and make it feel more interactive. So if you can turn on your cameras, that would be great. So today we're gonna have Deanna, who's gonna be speaking about Palestine and COVID, and then afterwards we'll be taking your questions, and we ask that you put your questions in the chat feature, and then I will be asking them one by one at the end of the lecture. So I had the pleasure of taking one of the best classes in my master's career with Deanna. Honestly, it was in addition to it being an amazing class, it was amazing to have a Palestinian professor who honestly was, again, one of the best professors I've ever had. She's a human rights lawyer and analyst based in Palestine. She's a frequent commentator on Palestine and Israel's violations of Palestinian rights. Her writings have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, CNN, and the BBC, among others. Today, Deanna is going to be discussing what coronavirus looks like in Palestine. Not only are our Palestinian sisters and brothers undergoing a pandemic like the rest of the world, but they're also going through the ongoing Israeli occupation. So without further ado, Deanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rania. And first, I want to thank you for all the excellent work that you're doing at PAC. And I want to thank you also for taking my class. And thank you for continuing to keep Palestine on the radar, even as we're all in a space where it's very difficult. We're worried about ourselves. We're worried about our loved ones. We're worried about what the world's going to look like afterwards. So I really appreciate the work that you and all of your colleagues are doing to make sure that the Palestine stays on the map during this very difficult time. So thank you. I was asking you beforehand what the other lectures have been, and I said to you that I want to switch gears from the other lectures that you've had and talk about what it looks like on the ground, what coronavirus looks like on the ground, and what is happening here. And as you mentioned, we're facing, obviously globally, this pandemic, but for Palestinians, it's not just a question of facing a pandemic, but also facing a very brutal occupation. And what we've seen throughout this period is that there hasn't even been a stepping on the brakes of the occupation throughout this entire period. In fact, it's actually been used as a means to try to accelerate a lot of Israel's human rights violations and land theft. So just to give you a picture, in the West Bank, they decided as of March the 5th, which was fairly early on, to enter into a series of closures and closing everything from universities and schools, to then amping it up and closing, as I'm sure you now have in Jersey and in other parts of the US, restaurants and other places. And the reason that they took the decision so early on is because, as I'm sure you're aware, Palestine doesn't really have a public healthcare system to speak of. They have a system, but it's a healthcare system that is not independent. It's under occupation. When a country controls your borders and controls the movement of goods and people and controls the supply of medical equipment, then you don't really have a very functioning public health system. And so very quickly on, the Palestinian Authority took the decision that the only way that they were going to try to avert the collapse in the healthcare system that we're seeing countries around the world that have fantastic healthcare systems pushed to the edge, such as Italy and Spain, the only way that they could do that was by enacting a series of closures very early on. Now, those measures were not just measures that were designed to kind of close down the West Bank, but unfortunately, these measures were not at all met by anything positive by the Israelis. In fact, what we ended up seeing was quite the opposite. And I'll get to that in just a second. Now, in 48, which is where I live, it was the same types of measures took place a week later, so on March the 12th. So effectively, since March the 12th, we've been living under the same system where things have been closed, whether it's the schools or universities, businesses, and so on and so forth. The difference, however, is that in the West Bank, what the Israelis did is that they didn't allocate and haven't, and still to this day haven't yet allocated the proper number of proper number of test kits to Palestinians in the West Bank. In fact, what they were doing was kind of doling them out, with like an eyedropper, if you were to think of it. So in very select numbers, very few numbers. In the West Bank, it gave only in the thousands. In the Gaza Strip, only in the hundreds. And here you're talking about a population of nearly 4 million that got less than 1/10 of the supplies, testing kit supplies that Israel has allocated for itself. But that wasn't the only problem. The other problem is that although the checkpoints have been closed down, in part because the Palestinian Authority also wanted these checkpoints closed down, what Israel has continued to do is that even though they...
Okay? Bye.
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Sorry, I'm going to mute everyone.
Oh, okay, thanks. Even though in the checkpoints were closed down in the West Bank, what Israel did was that it continued to use Palestinian workers in 48 Palestine, but instead of providing adequate protection, whether it's healthcare services or living living facilities, the facilities that they ended up providing for Palestinians were entirely substandard. And what we've now seen is that the new wave of people who are infected, who are returning back to the West Bank, who are returning back to Palestine, are people who are workers who've been working in establishments inside 48. And so we see that there's been massive neglect of Palestinians by the Israeli authorities when it comes to Palestinian workers. Another element that we have seen is that when it comes to Palestinian political prisoners. Now, Palestinian political prisoners have been since March the 15th under a complete shroud of secrecy. We actually don't really know what's happening in these prisons. Now, these are people who, many of them are elderly, many of them are quite ill. Many of them are disabled. Many of them are missing limbs. Some of them are really in a very poor state of health with cancers and so on and so forth. And yet, what the Israelis did, what the Israeli government did on March the 15th was that they enacted regulations to prevent anybody from being able to see these political prisoners and to be able to have any connection to these political prisoners, whether it's by phone or in person. And so since that period of time, people have been completely blocked from having any access to their family or even to their lawyers unless they're facing some type of hearing. And so we're seeing that, again, where it comes to these segments, these people, these individuals, that the Israeli authorities are using the coronavirus and the fear of the coronavirus to enact regulations to make sure that we don't have any connection to our loved ones. A third thing that we've been seeing here quite regularly is that at a time when we are being told to stay safe and stay at home, and you started out your talk, Rania, by saying, I hope everybody's staying safe, is that the Israeli authorities continue to demolish Palestinian homes. We've seen that just in March alone, that 10 Palestinian homes were demolished. And we've seen scores of Palestinians displaced during this period. So rather than Palestinians being able to stay safe, stay at home, it's actually quite the opposite, that they're making it so that Palestinians are homeless and completely displaced. We've also seen that during this period as well, that the Israelis are using the opportunity to carry out mass arrests, going into Palestinian homes with complete hazmat suits, in the full garb, and going in and again arresting Palestinians, including children. We saw that just in the month of March alone, that 85 Palestinians were arrested, including 10 children. These are all night raids that are being done. So far from it being a halt on the occupation or people focusing instead on trying to address the pandemic, instead it has been that we are, that Israel's using this cover to really amp up and to really extend its practices and its occupation deeper against Palestinians. Now, it doesn't just stop there. We've also seen that throughout this period, that while there's been so much attention paid to testing around the world, and we've heard this in different parts of the world, how Germany has averted a high number of cases because of early testing. When it comes to Israel, it's been the exact opposite, that when it comes to whether it's in the West Bank or within 48, that Palestinians have not at all been allowed to be tested. Again, it's the healthcare system that is held under occupation. And even for Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship, fewer than 11% of those who have been tested are Palestinians. And yet we're seeing that these numbers, the number of Palestinians who are infected, are on the rise. In fact, it's now 3 weeks behind the rate of infection that happened inside with Jewish Israeli towns, is now happening to Palestinian towns, because of the fact that they completely refused to test people. There was a real push by the NGOs to actually get these testings in place. And so the same system of racism that we have seen throughout Israel's history, whether it's in the face of Corona or not in the face of Corona, continues to rear its ugly head. And here we are now, exactly facing the exact same system that we had before Corona, but only exacerbated. We're still at a place where Palestinians are not getting adequate health care. We're still at a place where the occupation is being intensified. And we're getting to a place also where not only is the occupation being intensified, but in the eyes of many within the international community, it's being normalized. Tonight, just a few hours ago, there was a unity government agreement signed between Benjamin Netanyahu and Benjamin Gantz. And both of these individuals, far from being complete opposites, as many of them have portrayed them, are quite the opposite. They've placed hand in hand and are working hand in hand. One of the elements that they are now focusing on is, and it's going to be one of the first elements on their government action plan, is to annex the West Bank, to annex more and more Palestinian land and to steal more Palestinian land. And so far from the world coming forward and having an outcry to what it is that Israel's doing, unfortunately, this Corona, the pandemic, is serving as cover for them to continue to not only do what they've been doing in the past, but to also intensify their actions. Now, I'll leave lots of time open for questions for people who have them on that. But I also want to tell you about some of the other things that are happening here that are positive. And this wouldn't be the story of Palestine if we didn't talk about how there's so much resistance to everything that's happening in Palestine, to what the Israeli government is doing. And this ranges from simple things like keeping people safe and sane, to measures where we're trying to protect one another, to measures where we're trying to protect others as well. I was somebody who lived in Palestine during the 2002 Israeli invasion of Ramallah. And at the time, I remember very distinctly when the tanks came into the city of Ramallah. I remember very distinctly being taken out of my house at gunpoint. I remember very distinctly, as though it was yesterday, being sent into a gun battle. And I remember the days, actually weeks, months, of curfew and closure that we lived under during that period. And during that period, as now, the Israeli government used that lockdown to enact measures to deepen and to intensify the occupation. So I'll give you an example. Before 2002, there were checkpoints, but it wasn't as commonplace as after 2002. Before 2002, there were night raids, but they weren't as commonplace as after 2002. Before 2002, they were going in and demolishing people's homes, but not as commonplace as after 2002. And I remember just one sort of personal story was, I remember having a allergic reaction one night while we were under lockdown, and having to get to the hospital to deal with this allergic reaction, and being so terrified, thinking, am I going to die from the allergic reaction, or am I going to die being shot on the way to the hospital? And during that period, what kept me going, what kept everybody going, was the strength of our resolve and our resilience. Everything from, you know, my neighbors checking in on me, to friends making food for me, to the political prisoners reminding me that every day I was supposed to exercise, because if I didn't exercise, if I didn't have a healthy body, I didn't have a healthy mind, I couldn't resist. And we see these same types of measures now as we're facing a very different type of closure. So we've seen the various municipalities come forward and have things where they do daily exercise programs on Facebook, to having daily book reading, just in the same way that you're doing the book reading, the toddler programs. They're doing the same for Palestinians there. They're having people who are showing you daily what to cook. We have political prisoners who've been posting about the various exercise routines that they did when they were held in solitary confinement. We have people who are hosting dance parties for those who want to burn some extra calories and get moving. And we have everything that you can think of that is happening in different places around the world. It's also happening in Palestine, from yoga to theater to showing movies. All of this are the measures that I talk about, where it's staying sane and staying safe. But our generosity and our resilience it doesn't stop there. We've seen that in Khalil, there's been one factory that used to make shoes has now started making face masks. We've seen that people who, and I know you're going to have Wafa on in a couple of weeks, people who are interested in tatriz, doing tatriz masks, and showing people how to do that. We've also seen that that people have been innovative and generous. So we've seen shopkeepers in different parts, like different cities, like in Jerusalem, in Khalil, where they, rather than hoarding supplies, which these are the images that we're seeing from the US, it's been the opposite, where they just put out their groceries and put up signs that say, take what you need, no questions asked. We've seen youth that have come together to deliver food packets to people who don't have a regular food supply. And we've seen attempts to try to educate people in community settings using social distancing, because not everybody has access to the internet. And so that's been our side of generosity. And then there's been just an incredible resilience. Like the Al-Quds University has developed a low-cost ventilator, which if produced en masse could not only affect us, but can affect the world. As I'm sure you know, we only have fewer than 300 ventilators for all of Palestine, for all of, the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the occupied Palestine, the 67 occupied Palestine. 85% of those are already in use. And so creating a new ventilator, something that, it's so Palestinian. It's when there's a time and need, you see people step forward and come together. And that's what we have done. In 48 Palestine, we've seen that had it not been for the individual communities that have come together to make sure that the elderly are taken care of, that they receive their medication, and that families are fed, we would have left to its own devices. We know what the Israeli government would do with us. And so I want to end it on that note, Rania, and to everybody else, and open it up to any questions that you may have about what's going on here, anything that you'd like to ask. And thank you again, Rania, for your time, and thank you for all that you do.
Thank you so much for everything that you do, and for sharing with us, your expert experiences and your professional and your personal experiences. It really does put things into perspective for us. And I want to echo that. I know we're not living in Palestine, but it's also been amazing to see how the Palestinian American community has been really banding together, and the generosity is sometimes it blows your mind, because everyone's coming and really making it a point that this is our community and we're going to make sure we're taken care of. So like you said, it's the Palestinian generosity. So with that, I want to open it up to any questions. So if you would like, you can put it in the chat. If you can also potentially do a raise your hand feature. In the meantime, until I get a couple of questions, I have a question. So I noticed in America, we have a huge reliance on the government as to whether it's coming, actually happening and coming to fruition or not. Like we have something like unemployment, we have different things like that. I'm not too well versed with how the system works in Palestine, but I wanted to know, is there something like that in place? And if not, then what is taking care of everybody? Because I know everybody's right now essentially out of a job.
This is a really important question, Rania. And the answer is we don't have that in place. We don't have, so I'm going to distinguish between 48 and between 67. And so in the part of Palestine that's currently occupied, it's all occupied, but I'm going to distinguish it between 48 and occupied. In occupied Palestine, there is no social insurance system. It just doesn't exist. And because it doesn't exist, this is where, at least for me, this is where my fear is. So the reason it doesn't exist because for a large number of years, there were the majority of the mainstay or the main source of Palestinian income was Palestinians who were working in 48. And for years, actually to this current day, from 67 until the current day, Israel has refused to ever give over the money that they actually collected from these workers in the form of taxes. They've refused to hand it over to Palestinians. So if you can believe that for all these years, people were working and paying taxes, and Israel was collecting like what we call Social Security in the US, the equivalent of the Social Security payments I'm thinking of Canada, that's why I was trying to find the wording. They were collecting the equivalent of the Social Security payments, and they have never handed it over to either to the people who worked there or to the Palestinian Authority. So that's the primary reason that we don't have a Social Security system that is in place. The second reason is that the mainstay of the Palestinian economy is the major employer is the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority is mostly donor funded. And so because it's donor funded, there's never been a mechanism to be able to create a social security system or social security safety net. So during this period now, if you are not employed by the government, if you are private, if you are either employed by a company or you're self-employed or a small business owner, there is no mechanism to be able to compensate you. And so this is where, at least for me, one of the fears is that as now, like after all of this is over, and as we try to return to a quote unquote normal situation, my fear is that the governments, the donors that were once giving money to the Palestinian Authority are simply not going to be giving money any longer, because their money is instead going to be spent on trying to finance stimulus packages for their own countries. So they're not going to be looking at what it is that we need. They're going to be looking at what it is that they need. Now, also to put it into perspective, the Israeli government has for years been withholding, they've refused to hand over tax money that is rightfully the money that belongs to the Palestinian people. They refuse to hand that over. And again, there's no pressure that has been brought to bear on the Israeli government. So remember, I was talking about how things become normalized. For years now, the Israeli government has been deducting money, and you're never going to believe the list when I tell you all of the things that they deduct. They deduct money for providing us electricity, even though they're supposed to provide us with electricity. They deduct money from the Palestinian people for a sewage treatment facility that belongs to a settlement. We're supposed to clean up their sewage, is the way that the logic goes. They're deducting money for damage that's happening to the orchards along the Gaza Strip because of the Great March of Return. Again, we're not supposed to be protesting. They're deducting money for Palestinians who are getting cancer treatment inside hospitals inside 48, even though they don't allow us to do adequate to do cancer treatment in the occupied Palestinian territory. They're deducting money for the latest is that they're deducting money for the money that goes to support families of martyrs and support families of political prisoners. And so all told, as we're now looking into the future and looking at how to support these people who have lost their livelihood, one major source of money is our own money. And my fear is that we won't be able to access it because there's just not going to be that level of pressure brought to bear on the Israeli government to release the money that they have stolen from us. It's actually theft that they're doing. So families that have been out of work now for over a month, we're in our 6th week now, have nobody to rely on. Nobody to rely on except ourselves. And that's why it's so, to see the generosity that I was talking about, it becomes even more magnified when you realize that that it's not just a small scale matter, but it's a huge issue, because these are monies that will never be recouped.
Yeah, thank you for that. I guess my follow-up question, and then we'll get into the questions in the chat box, is what can we do to put, I guess, that pressure to make sure that things change?
I think that there's a few things that can be done. So one is, I know that oftentimes people don't believe in the power of the U.S. Congress, and with good reason. But I think that it's important that they hear from you. And I think that as you were talking about the census and the importance of that, I also think it's very important for them to realize that they have an obligation. The United States right now is Israel's biggest enabler, and there needs to be pressure placed on your representatives of government so that they're constantly hearing your voices. The other things that you can do is continue to support the grassroots movements that are in place here. And Rania, I'm happy to send you with a list of some of the grassroots organizations that have been doing amazing work here, whether it's legal organizations that have been challenging the Israeli government's racism, to medical organizations that have been going out and to make sure that communities are getting adequate supplies, to other organizations that are demanding that are trying to do cleanups in and around Jerusalem, and who've been shut down. I'm happy to provide you with a list of those organizations, and to the extent that you can, that people can support that, then that's also a great direct way. And for those of you who have families, support your families to the extent that you can. We're in a unique situation in that this isn't a case where a government is going to come to people's aid or support. It's quite the opposite. The Israeli government is going to do everything in its power to try to bring us to our knees.
Thank you very much. I would appreciate that list, and we'll try to circulate it to everyone present. That would be really appreciated. So the first question we have in the chat is from Farah. She asks, what areas of public health expertise or resources are still needed more in Palestine? For example, epidemiologists, physicians, clinical lab specialists, and other clinical and or research professionals. Do health workers or researchers in Palestine have partners in other countries to help with their efforts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't know specifically. It's a great question. I wouldn't know how to answer that specifically, like without, with the accuracy. I can tell you that from my experience and from what I know, there's always a need for people who are working in public health. We have in Palestine, this is one of the tragedies of Palestine, is that we're having a brain drain. And by brain drain, what I mean is that it's not because people don't want to help Palestine or don't believe in supporting Palestine or don't love their country. It's quite the opposite. It's just that when you have a system that is under so much Israeli control and under for more than 50 years of occupation, there is very little space for young physicians to be able to assist and to grow and develop. And so what we've seen is that many within the medical profession and within the public health system are leaving Palestine because the system just isn't a system that can absorb them. And so there is definitely a need. Now, to answer the specific question of how many doctors, epidemiologists, et cetera, I actually don't have that. I don't have that information. But what I can say is that there are some good organizations that are working on the ground that have partnered with physicians around the world. For example, the PCRF, Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. They've done amazing work at partnering with physicians around the world, bringing physicians to Palestine and vice versa, bringing patients to other places and doing training for Palestinian physicians as well. They've done an amazing job, and the Ministry of Health has also been trying to do many of these outreach, these connection programs as well. But we're just not at a system where it's strong enough, and that's because of the nature of occupation, and because of the fact that we just don't see that the Israelis aren't allowing us to breathe and grow. Because they're not allowing us to breathe and grow, one of the areas that takes a hit is public health.
Thank you very much. So our next question is from Bassem, who's one of our biggest supporters. Thank you, Bassem, for tuning in. So what will the Sulta, the Palestinian Authority, do if Israel begins to take Area C lands in a big way? Will they resign and enforce a one-state solution?
No. Would they? No. Should they? Yes. So the answer is no. Look, I'm going to step back for a second and talk about what annexation is and what it isn't. So annexation is taking of land illegally. It's illegal under international law. And the reason that it's illegal under international law is that one of the basic principles of law is that you can't go and steal your neighbor's house. If you do, then it's going to lead to war. And so one of the basic principles is you just cannot acquire territory by force. Now, what Israel has done over the years is that they've been slowly carrying out the policies of annexation. And what I mean by that is that they have already transferred a number of things to the Israeli authorities. So already we see that, for example, Israeli settlers are tried under criminals who are Israeli settlers face a different prosecution system than Palestinians. The Israelis go under what's considered to be a civilian system. Palestinians face a military court system. We already see that there are different crimes, different punishments for the exact same crime based on what your religion is and what they call nationality, quote unquote nationality. We've already seen that in the Israeli settlements, they're pretty much like every other main Israeli city around, which is that they have bus lines, they have, you can get internet services, you have water services, you're connected to the electricity, you have all of the malls, all of the banking facilities. It's just like Tel Aviv Ariel is no different from Tel Aviv, Ariel being one of the largest settlements in the West Bank. And so on the face of it, it has already annexed a large part of land. The only thing that remains with annexation is two elements. One is that it removes the face of the Israeli government. It shows its real face that says, for years, the Israeli government has been saying that they believe in negotiations and that they believe in a Palestinian state, and they've never said Palestinian freedom, but they do say they believe in a Palestinian state. This is now removing that mask, and they're now coming forward very clearly and saying, actually, we don't believe in a Palestinian state. So that's one. The second thing it does, and the second part is very important, is that the only element that remains as right now as different between the Israeli, let's say, city of Tel Aviv and Ariel, the settlement, is planning. And by that, I mean that they cannot build and expand the settlement by themselves. So let's say, for example, take a city in like here, Haifa, which is where I live right now. If Haifa wants to build more housing units, it has to go through its own little planning process, but it can eventually build more housing units. That's not the case for the Israeli settlements. It still needs to go through a centralized planning system that is governed by the Israeli Knesset. That's the only difference. Now, but that difference is important. And the reason that I and others have been pushing back against annexation is that I don't want to be the person that says here to the Israelis, go ahead, you have that green light, you get to do whatever it is that you want to do, right? So to answer, Bassem, your question, will the Palestinian Authority throw in the towel and say, we're going to dissolve ourselves? The answer is no. The reason that they won't do it is because if all of the 25 years of failed negotiations didn't make them throw in the towel, this element is certainly not going to make them do it. They've been threatening to do it, but they won't do it. Should they do it? For me, the answer is that they should have changed the nature of the Palestinian Authority many, many, many moons ago. And they should have been changing the nature of the way that they speak of Palestine and what Palestinian resistance is many, many moons ago. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen. Instead, what I think that we're going to see is that we'll see a lot of talk about the evils of annexation. We'll hear a lot of things about what the Israeli government is doing, but they're really not going to do anything more substantive about it than that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So the next question is from Paolo, which covers some of the things that we were just discussing, but if you want to elaborate a little bit more on it. What would change for Palestinians if Israel were to officially annex the West Bank or parts of the West Bank? Could they justify to the international community not giving Palestinians citizenship and the right to vote?
They'll certainly try. So what will change for Palestinians is kind of not much. We, as I mentioned, we're already living under a system of apartheid, where you have different laws applying to different people in different ways. We already are, much of the land, at least in the Jordan Valley, most of it has already been annexed. We've already seen that the Israeli government is slowly making life more miserable for people so that they eventually leave. And they're trying to hasten that day by day. And so on the ground, we're not going to see a huge change for Palestinians, except that it's going to be worse. And by the international community, can Israel justify? Hard to say. This is why I think that there needs to be a change in strategy. And I don't just believe that it's a question of one person, one vote, but there has to be a focus on decolonization. And that's something that the Palestinian Authority hasn't done. For 2.5 decades, arguably 3 decades, if not more, all that they've been focused on is a state. And when you go down that path of saying that that you want is a state, it doesn't really matter if the state is big or small or whatever. You know, the Trump plan envisions some kind of silly state, which is not a state. But they should instead be focused on something else. And I just don't think that the Palestinian Authority at this point in time is going to be pushing for anything different than what we've seen.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Janine. She says, can you speak about how the Palestinian Authority has been handling things? Also, Trump just recently withdrew WHO funding. Is this going to have an impact on the ability to contain COVID in Palestine?
So how has the Palestinian Authority been doing? Remarkably well. And I'm not somebody who gives them a huge pat on the back usually, but I think that this government, in particular the Minister of Health, recognized very quickly that this is a very serious issue. They very quickly shut things down at great expense, and to people. They have been really closely monitoring what's happening. They've been raising awareness with people. They've been telling people, giving very clear instructions to people about what to do, what not to do. They've been highlighting when there's things that are going wrong, such as when workers are coming back, and raising issues with the international community when we see that workers are coming back and are not being tested or have already been infected. So you know, even people who are usually very critical of the authority have been talking about how good of a job that they have been doing during this period, mostly because I think that they saw the risk early and took decisive action very early. In terms of WHO funding, is this going to have an impact? I'm not so sure about that. I think that the measures that have been put into place by the Palestinian Authority, the very early measures of social distancing, are probably going to be the most decisive when it comes to action here. But of course, any cut in funding to any of these UN agencies ultimately ends up harming people who need that assistance the most. And Palestine is one of those places that needs a lot of assistance. Cutting WHO funding, at least in the case of Palestinians, this is a slight aside, but if somebody has a cancer that can be treated through radiation, because Israel has put a complete block on all radiation therapy, Palestinians cannot get any treatment if they have cancer in a hospital, in any Palestinian hospital in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. They can get treatment in a hospital in East Jerusalem or in 48, but they have to get an Israeli permit. And it's been the WHO that's really been at the forefront of pushing for these permits, pushing for Palestinians to get permits. So when I talk about the healthcare system being under occupation, it's under occupation before the coronavirus. It's been under occupation since 1967 for decades, and it's not letting up.
Thank you very much. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. I do have one more question. Obviously, with Gaza being essentially an open air prison, do you have any updates on that? How are things going? How are they dealing with it differently than maybe in the West Bank?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, in Gaza, it's been for the most part contained. I used to live there, and when coronavirus first started happening, I kept having these nightmares that it was going to spread very quickly in Gaza, and it's one of those areas that kind of keeps you up at night. Having lived there for a year and a half, I remember living there before the current form of blockade. I lived under a different form of blockade in 2005 to 2006. And I remember things like the water system being completely contaminated. I remember washing my hair and my hair falling out from the salt water. I remember the food shortages, and so it's a place that is very near and dear to my heart. And alhamdulillah, there's 13 cases. There were 13 cases. They're now reporting that it's down to 7 cases. And the way that they have been, they've been handling them is through extreme quarantine. So the people who have tested positive have been completely quarantined, and through that, it's hoped. I don't know if we're out of it, but it's hoped that has been the mechanism of being able to at least contain the spread of it. We'll see. But I can tell you that the healthcare system there, it couldn't handle the injured when I was there, which was in 2005 and 2006. Again, I had to go to the hospital when I lived over there, and these were people who, some of the most amazing doctors in the world, who were operating with virtually nothing. And today it's even worse. Since 2014, the system has been on the verge of collapse. Since the Great Return March happened in 2018, it's been on such a verge of collapse that even I was reading one doctor in Switzerland was saying that a Swiss hospital wouldn't be able to handle what the hospitals in Gaza are handling. So they've always been on the verge of collapse. They have a total of 87 ventilators in Gaza. 80 of them are already in use. And so it's not a place that would be able to handle anything of the magnitude that we're even seeing in the West Bank, where we have 323 confirmed cases. But fortunately, we're seeing the numbers actually going down, and that there hasn't been an increased spread, and that's because of extreme quarantine that they've been putting into place.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Jihad, who asks, do you believe that the Minister of Health works as ambassador to Italy gave some help with her dealings with the crisis?
Yeah, I don't know for a fact, but yes, because she, the current, our Minister of Health, May, she has, I think apparently she was trained in Italy, and she really has been doing she's been doing a very, very good job here at really just keeping people informed. They have briefings. You're part of the, as I'm sure you're feeling this, part of the issue with this is that there's a lot of fear, and people just don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And she's been doing a really good job of having these daily briefings, sometimes twice a day, just updating people and letting people know what the state of health is right now in Palestine, and trying to keep people's sense of ill ease and anxiety, keeping it at bay. And she's done a very good job.
Thank you. Amin is asking, are you aware of any increased coordination between the West Bank and Gaza governments during COVID crisis?
No, there have been rumors of it, but not really. This is one of the tragedies of our existence right now. One would have hoped that in times of crisis, like the first attack on Gaza in 2008, 2009, the second attack on Gaza in 2011, the third attack on Gaza in 2014, and now this, you would have hoped that that there would have been some attempt to get past the very petty differences and come together, but we haven't at all seen that. And the only coordination so far that we have been seeing is that there's been attempts to try to get more test kits into Gaza, and that's it. So there really hasn't been more than that's been happening.
Hopefully one day.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Bassem asks, what would happen if the Sultan goes to the UN and disavows the Oslo Agreement and withdraws the recognition of Israel? Can we force the world to rise and put Israel in their place?
Again, I hope so. I hope so. Look, this is okay, so I'm going to just step back for a second and express a little bit of frustration. So, one of the problems with this current government, I know we should be talking about COVID, but I also want to talk about the government. One of the problems with this government is it's not just that the president has been the president for 15 years when he was only elected for 4. It's that he has taken measures where he just doesn't, not willing to recognize that there were mistakes that were made and that there are alternative strategies that are out there. And so for me, this has been incredibly frustrating because they behave, I'm saying they because it's the government, behave as though we're still in the year 1996 when we're in the year 2020, and like the world has moved past. So one of the mistakes of Oslo was granting recognition to Israel when Israel didn't recognize anything other than the PLO as being the sole legitimate representative. They didn't promise that there was going to be freedom. They didn't promise that there was going to be an end to occupation or statehood, or even the basics that they were looking for, which is a state. There was nothing promised to them. And so they've been operating since 1993 when they first signed Oslo and recognized Israel, as though it's still 1993 or at best 1996. And this is the part that for me is so super frustrating, is that we're not in 1996 anymore. In fact, we're in a much worse situation than in 1996. In 1996, there was still a sense that there was perhaps some pressure that was going to be brought to bear on Israel. Today, that doesn't exist. Today, it's completely like out of the realm of the possible that people would even dare to put pressure on Israel to withdraw from the settlements, dismantle the settlements, to have refugee return. I mean, it's so far out of the realm of the possible, and yet he keeps talking in the same way. And so could there be a different path? Yes. And there had been tons of people who've said to him, maybe you should start pursuing a different path. but it's been a government that has really been stubbornly focused on one path. Now, to be fair, they're stubbornly focused on this one path because they're now in a corner that they can't get out of. And that corner that they're in is that Israel, Israel has made the Palestinian economy entirely dependent on Israel. They've made Palestinian movement entirely dependent on Israel's whims. And so they've been placed into a corner where you're either at the whims of the donor community or you're at the whims of the Israeli government. And so there isn't a lot of room to maneuver, but that's not to say that there wasn't at different points in time. And it's also not to say that there isn't scope for maneuvering today. There is, but they're still very much fixated on the same system of two-state solution achieved through negotiations, just resolution for the refugees, which means no refugee return, border modifications, which means that the settlements get to remain. Everything, accommodating Israeli security, which means that they get to do whatever they want to do. And that's just, we have moved past that. We as a people have moved past that, and this government has not. Now, one thing that I do want to highlight is that although we have moved past that, and this is important for people to understand, we are also going down the path of having a very repressive regime. We have no parliament any longer, which means that if Abu Mazen is to die tomorrow, we have no idea, literally no idea, who will become president or how. We have judges that are controlled by the Palestinian Authority. We have had crackdown on media to the point where a lot of people who are in independent media get imprisoned. There are crackdowns on websites. Entire websites are blocked. Anything that's critical of the authority is blocked over there. And now they've also begun cracking down on NGOs, any of the NGOs that are critical of the government. So this isn't just a question of them like following the same strategy of 1996, but it's following the same strategy of 1996 with a very repressive regime, with imprisonments still, arrests and imprisonments still happening at Israel's request, and so on. I mean, you name it, and it's still happening.
Thank you very much. I think this is our last question for the evening, if anyone else would like to add. Lema asks, what's going on with the Great Return March? And are there any general protests that are happening right now?
The Great Return March was continuing their protests up until, I think a couple of weeks ago, but they've since been suspended, for mostly because of the coronavirus, but they have no intent to stop them, and they keep making sure. This is like 2 years now of people every Friday, with very few exceptions, coming out and demanding their rights, and so the only things so far that have stopped them was there were a few times that they had to, because of there were some issues that were happening in Gaza, and then also now due to the coronavirus. But my understanding is that they're just suspended, but they're still going to resume.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very enlightening talk. Definitely puts things in perspective. And I believe we don't have any more questions. With that, I'm going to wrap up the event. Thank you so much, Deanna, for your time. I know it's very late at night for you, so I really, really appreciate it. And hopefully one day we can see a free Palestine.
Inshallah.
So to our audience members, we want to remind you all to please take your census at your earliest convenience. And we challenge you to also get 5 other people to take your census. As we've discussed today, it is very important for us to get counted and for our voices to be heard. These webinars are brought to you by PAC, so please don't forget to check out our website and see a complete list of everything else that we're offering. If you like anything that you saw today or anything that we've been doing, please make sure to support us and donate what you can. I've put the link in the chat below. Thank you so much. Stay safe, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.